I'm Elliot Gerson, Executive Vice President of the Aspen Institute. I don't have an idea, but I have an introduction. Because of the legal, medical, cultural, and political earthquake that struck Washington, D.C. just after 10 a.m. yesterday, our extraordinary ideas team whirled into action to put together a panel to discuss the opinion and its significance on very short order, a panel of people who did not expect to be on this stage today, and also managed to pluck a remarkable moderator who thought she would be hiking at Maroon Bells right now. Before I introduce that moderator, I'd like to share two very brief but I think relevant historical stories or historical points. One that very few people know, and one that I think very few people remember. The one that very few people know relates intimately to the Aspen Institute, and the one that very few people remember relates to the changes, there were incredible changes in the judicial and political systems and how they've transformed in the last half century. The Institute story involves an American giant who will be best known for writing the majority opinion in Roe against Wade. Justice Harry Blackmun started coming to Aspen in 1979, and he moderated a seminar called the Justice and Society Seminar, one that we still offer. Over many, many summers and all the weeks he spent here, he came to regard here, and indeed this very meadow, as one of his favorite and most loved places. And indeed, that's now been recognized by judicial scholars who've looked at the evolution of his philosophy. What is not well known is that he loved this place so much that he instructed his family to distribute some of his ashes right here on this meadow. Matter of fact, I ran into Linda Greenhouse, his biographer, while her book about him was in galleys. And I mentioned, how are you going to deal with the fact that Justice Blackmun's ashes are at Aspen? And she looked at me like I was completely out of my mind and said, no, that's not possible. He was buried at Arlington Cemetery. Well, she called the family and found out, indeed, that not all of his remains are in Arlington Cemetery. So for those of you who are interested, and here, if we can, you can see a little plaque, and I'll tell you in a minute where it is, and then you can take a second to read what it says. And I think given the events of yesterday, that's entirely appropriate. For those of you interested, when you're walking to Door Hosier, just after the large mound, look off on your right in the corner of the lawn, and you will see that little stone. The second very brief story is a more personal one, but I think quite relevant to see how the sands have shifted in American culture and politics. I was a Supreme Court clerk a short number of years after the Roe decision. Indeed, 8 of the 9 justices I was privileged to work with were the same justices as on the Roe court. What is now often forgotten is that in that majority opinion, written by Justice Blackmun, of course, a proud Republican, there were 4 Republican votes. It was an opinion, a 7-2 opinion. The dissenting votes were a Democrat and a Republican. So just a reminder as we move into this next discussion of just how much things have changed. So now I am delighted to welcome up as our moderator, who will introduce this very timely panel, Jennifer Senior, staff writer of The Atlantic, and we're very proud to say, the winner of the 2022 Pulitzer Prize for feature writing. Jennifer.
Thank you for that gracious introduction. One day you're going to have to tell me if there was any public intellectual of note who is not associated with Aspen. That's crazy. Okay, Steve Leddick is one of the foremost experts in constitutional law and the federal courts, and is a professor at the University of Texas School of Law. Cue adorable hand sign, right. Katie Keith is director of the Health Policy and Law Initiative at Georgetown. Jane Coaston is an opinion writer at the New York Times and host of its podcast, The Argument. And David French is a former writer for the National Review, now a colleague of mine at The Atlantic and senior editor at The Dispatch. So welcome, everyone. Okay, so Steve, you have read this decision. You have read the leaked version of this decision. You have read the current version of this decision. Tell us, 31 hours in, what your thoughts are about it and how you think that it most dramatically changes the legal landscape.
How long do we have?
Yeah, I know.
So I think it would help to put this whole case in context. So this case was about a law Mississippi passed in the summer of 2018, not coincidentally at the same time that Justice Anthony Kennedy retired from the Supreme Court and was replaced by Justice Brett Kavanaugh. And the law banned most abortions in Mississippi after the 15th week of pregnancy. So it was not a frontal assault on the entire edifice of a constitutional right to abortion, but it was an assault on the most recent precedent, Casey, because the Supreme Court had drawn the line at viability closer to 20 to 24 weeks. Then, when Justice Ginsburg dies in the fall of 2020, is replaced by Justice Barrett, Mississippi changed its ask. So instead of asking the Supreme Court to uphold the law, even notwithstanding Roe and Casey, Mississippi said, why don't you just overrule Roe and Casey? And in the majority opinion written by Justice Samuel Alito, 5 justices said, cool. Right? And so basically, there were 2 main thrusts to the 108-page opinion. I suspect you all have not read every word of it, but it's actually not that different from the leaked version that we saw in May. Big point number 1, there is no constitutional right to abortion because there's no such right that is deeply rooted in our nation's historical and cultural tradition. Big point number 2, considerations of stare decisis, the notion that in general courts should follow their precedents, did not support retaining Roe and Casey as precedent, therefore they should be overruled. There were 4 other opinions. There was a concurrence by Justice Thomas, who would have gone even further and attacked other laws, other Supreme Court decisions lacking a similar historical foundation. He specifically calls out Griswold about contraception, Lawrence versus Texas about same-sex intimacy, Obergefell versus Hodges about same-sex marriage. There's Justice Kavanaugh, who basically says, no, 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 you have nothing to fear. This is just about abortion, because apparently that's cool. Chief Justice Roberts concurred in the judgment. He would have upheld Mississippi's law, but not completely eliminated a right to abortion up to 15 weeks. So a sort of split the difference, we don't have to go there kind of opinion. Part of why the headlines you guys have seen are a little bit confused about the vote count is because folks don't know how to count him. Short version, right? He did not agree that Roe should be completely overruled, but he did agree that Mississippi's law should be upheld, hence why you see 5-4-6-3. And then I think a very angry, feisty, and ultimately sad joint dissent from the 3 liberal justices, Stephen Breyer, Sonia Sotomayor, Elena Kagan. I think, I don't want to say too much more because I really think the other folks should weigh in. I think it's worth stressing this is an earthquake as a matter of constitutional law. This is an earthquake as a matter of the Supreme Court as an institution. This is an earthquake from the perspective of our national politics. I think it's an earthquake from the perspective of our discourse. Overnight, we've seen so-called trigger laws go into effect. So far, I think in 6 states, although that number could be higher by tomorrow. These are laws that have been passed in advance of yesterday's decision that says as soon as the Supreme Court decides Roe, abortion will be illegal in our state. There are a number of other states that have trigger laws that will go into effect in the coming days and weeks, so that by a month from now, it'll be somewhere north of a dozen. There are states that have so-called zombie laws that are pre-1973 bans on abortion that have never been repealed. And so that could theoretically go back into effect once the Supreme Court decision takes formal effect. And then there are all the other states where abortion is still going to be available, legal, perhaps even in higher demand. And so what we're going to have is 2 Americas. One in which abortion access is virtually impossible, and one in which abortion access is widely available. And one of the huge questions yesterday's decision raises and doesn't answer is how hard is it going to be for those in the states where abortion access is not available at all to obtain any kind of care either by leaving the state or for those who can't by perhaps having pharmaceuticals shipped in. Again, Justice Kavanaugh says not to worry, we'll take care of it. Suffice to say, I am a little more circumspect.
You have anticipated two of the questions that I plan on asking further. Let's key off of one thing you just said for Katie. Yes, the trigger laws, the zombie laws, all those things. Let's talk about real world outcomes. How does this tangibly affect women's health and healthcare right now?
Thank you for the question. Two Americas, I think, is absolutely right. Steve has it spot on. The data is very squishy. As you just heard him say, states are sort of in flux. Things are changing minute by minute, hour by hour. You could probably see that from your Twitter threads yesterday about how much is changing in real time. So the data I'm going to give you is sort of pre-Roe, or pre-decision, folks anticipating what would happen in the wake of Roe. Some of this might change over time, but I do think the data is important. We're going to talk about the legal issues and the cultural issues and all, but we really have to, I think, hold women at the center right now, especially today, especially maybe for all of us in this room who've been deeply, deeply upset and troubled by this decision. So I think a couple key data points to share is, 33.6 million women of childbearing age live in the 28 states that we eventually expect to come online. It's more than half of women of childbearing age, meaning age 15 to 44, more than half. So that's sort of the first statistic to sort of dig in on. Overwhelmingly, these are young women. Very, very important. 39% are under the age of 24. 9% of those are teenagers. So when I listen to Eileen give her big idea and talk about how devastating this is as an 18-year-old Olympian, that is a very real statistic and very real for many young women all across the country, young women. Overwhelmingly, this is about low-income women. Most women who obtain an abortion are at the poverty level or below, and many are, and you've seen some commentary today, you're probably going to hear some commentary today from this panel about how states could really step up and do pro-life policies and support women in these new families that we're going to be forced to create. And overwhelmingly, women are in these states where there is no Medicaid expansion. There is no support for postpartum women on Medicaid. There is no child care. There is no paid family leave. There is no living wage. And so we are having, forcing low-income women to carry a pregnancy to term without these societal structures in the vast majority of states that we're talking about. Disproportionately, these are women of color that are obtaining abortions, and again, disproportionately Black women and Latina women. That is because of structural racism and unequal access to housing, food, jobs, education, security, all of that. It also has to do with geography, which is probably my last jumping off point in terms of the data. Most Black people live in the South, which is where the vast majority of many of the trigger laws and the restrictions that we're going to see come online. It's the South and the Midwest. And we really, really care about that. The suggestion is that 30% of abortion providers are going to be knocked out by this decision. They're in these states. We're going to take out a third of access. And I don't know how many people have followed this issue before this decision. Access was already pretty shitty. And so to knock out a third of providers is going to be devastating. And I don't know how many folks were here earlier this morning. Many of us had the opportunity to hear from the Secretary of Health and Human Services, Javier Becerra. He happened to be on site at the only remaining clinic in Missouri yesterday when the decision came down. And he said within hours, they had tried to figure out the legal strategy and said, we have to close. And we're going to send the women here. They had a plan. They were going to send the women across the border to Illinois. That is extremely disruptive and troubling, but also probably the best case scenario that we're talking about. Because when you look at sort of the geography of this, women in New Orleans who need an abortion, they're also going to have to go to that clinic in Illinois. We're talking, and one of the studies showed that 39% of women post-Roe are going to have to travel on average 250 miles to get an abortion. What that does is it drops the abortion rate by about a third. We're creating barrier after barrier. So yes, there will still be an abortion. It will still be legal. We are making it almost near impossible for many women, I think, to access this care.
So one question that I want to ask you later after we've addressed the other two panelists, but I want to find out about the legal ramifications if I'm a person in a state that where I can no longer get an abortion, and I want to go to Illinois. Am I going to be legally liable? Is the person who drives me going to be legally liable? Are my doctor's notes going to be looked at? We're going to discuss all of that. Just remember it. hold it in your head. Also, before we get on, I just want to ask you one thing. This panel, a version of this panel happened last night. There was an emergency convening of another one of these, so it's Groundhog Day for these two a bit. And one thing that you said that I just think might bear repeating early on is you said that you thought that this case unsettled more than it settled. And can you just talk about that very briefly?
Absolutely. I think this raises more questions than it answers. And this was actually part of the court's decision. I think pro-life advocates have long been saying this Casey decision that Steve was talking about, sort of the precursor here, that was also overturned by the court yesterday, is so unworkable. There's so much litigation. You're bringing us so many cases. There's all these questions. And they have just sort of opened up a hornet's nest of even more. The idea that it'll be simpler by returning this issue to the states is absolutely outrageous. And I can think of, some states are going to do some wild things they've already tried, and it's going to get worse, I think, beginning in January. There's these novel interstate issues that you were referencing about what does the right to travel mean here. There's more federal-state interactions of FDA preemption. How do you operate a federal program in some of these states if there's no access? And then I think there's huge private sector implications as well. So many more questions than it answers.
Okay. David, you are quite bullish on the fact that this has been sent back to the states, right? Okay, so I would love to ask you a couple of questions. First of all, we are already a very frightful, am I reverberating a little? Anyway, we are already a frightfully polarized nation, maybe an irremediably polarized nation, right? So you're still bullish on this opinion, so tell me why. And tell me why I shouldn't, or we shouldn't be nervous that this isn't going to polarize us any further.
Well, I'm not going to say we shouldn't be nervous about that.
Yeah.
Okay, because I don't think there's such thing as a super clear path forward here. I think if somebody's going to tell you, I'm going to predict in 5 years it's going to be like this, in 10 years, I agree, this is an earthquake. It's an earthquake that follows an earthquake. Roe versus Wade was an earthquake. It was a highly polarizing decision. It has been the issues that have arisen out of Roe versus Wade have been deeply polarizing this country for almost 50 years now. In 1992, Ruth Bader Ginsburg delivered a Madison lecture at New York University, and she said at that lecture that Roe was breathtaking in scope. And she openly mused out loud. So she said in Roe, the court was looking at one of the most extreme abortion laws in the country at that time in Texas. And she openly questioned, well, what if the court had overturned only the Texas law without supplanting or displacing all abortion laws in the country? Would we be in the same place that we are now? She was musing about this in 1992. And I think that's a very valid question in 2022 as it was in 1992. Because if you look around the world, one of the things you see around the world and other places is you do not see countries polarized around abortion the way this country has been for so long. Why is that? It's not because all of these countries are so completely culturally coherent and have the same progressive view of abortion rights. In fact, the United States is an outlier because of Roe. It's got one of the least restrictions on abortion prior to the overturning of Roe of any country in the world because of Roe. The democratic process was deeply restricted in its ability to reach this issue because of Roe, and that was inherently destabilizing. Many of these other countries, they've had an opportunity in the democratic process to work through this and to achieve policies that reflect the will of the majority of the citizens. We did not have that possibility. So here's what I'm worried about in the short term, and I am hopeful about in the long term. What I'm worried about in the short term is this. Have y'all noticed politics are dysfunctional right now? This opinion lands into the most dysfunctional political environment of my adult lifetime. We are not overrun with wise political leaders. Particularly in where I am, in red America. I live in a very red state, in a very red neighborhood of a very red state. Performative, punitive legislation is the fashion of the day right now. And that's extraordinarily dangerous. And I am worried that we will, in the short term, see a wave of performative, punitive legislation. I'm very worried about that. I also have a degree remaining faith in the American people, that over time the American people assert themselves, and over time the American people moderate the extremes. And that's my long-term hope, but my short-term nervousness is how much damage will be done through performative politics in the short term.
Jane, the skepticism is legible on your face. Do you not have the same faith in the American people?
It's not a lack of faith in the American people. It is a lack of faith in American states. I want to be clear here that I do think that one of the challenges, or one of the actual gifts to the anti-abortion wing of American politics that Roe gave, was the gift of maximalism. Maximalism is so easy when you don't think you're ever going to have to do it. We see, I grew up in the Catholic Church, and I spent a lot of time in evangelical circles when I was in high school. It was a strange time in my life. Don't get into it. And I don't remember people who worked so hard against abortion saying, we'd be okay with France's abortion laws. We'll be fine with a 15-week ban. No, if you believe that abortion is murder, you don't think abortion becomes less murdery at that 15-week mark. And I think that that's what we see in so many of these states like Mississippi, which interestingly also has the highest maternal mortality rate in the country, and also has an incredibly high rate of infant mortality. So we are saying in a lot of these states that maximalism is going to be what will take place. You are going to see that people voted for people who said that abortion was murder and it should be illegal. And we've seen already in the state of Louisiana, though this was walked back, that there was an effort to have women who had abortions be given the death penalty. Because if you believe abortion is murder, what is the punishment for murder? And I remember there was a National Review piece back in 2007 that was in response to this question: what should happen to women who have abortions? How should they be punished? And all of the responses from National Review authors were basically like, don't worry about it, that won't happen, why are you even asking? Because I think that in some ways, the existence of Roe offered this umbrella of protection, where you could say, like, yes, abortion is murder, but, there's not really anything we're going to do about it. Well, now there is. States will have laws that will punish women in a variety of ways for having abortions, or for having what the state believes to be abortions. If a woman uses drugs while pregnant, if a woman falls down the stairs and it doesn't look accidental enough, we are asking lower courts. We're not even talking about state-level courts. We're asking sheriffs in small towns. We're asking, kind of low-level judicial authorities in small towns in Texas and Oklahoma to decide whether or not they think something is a miscarriage. Something we've already seen women being tried for murder for having miscarriages because the fetus tested positive for drugs or for any number of reasons. And I think that the other thing, there's a lot that bothers me right now. Otherwise, this is just going to turn into a list of things that grind my gears. But I think that one thing that gets me is that we now see a host of people who oppose abortion saying, well, now is the time to create this world in which abortion is both legally impermissible and culturally unthinkable. Well, they had 50 years to do the latter, but they really focused on the former. This is a long-term effort. If you've followed conservative politics for as long as I have and as long as a lot of other people have, you knew that this was the question. This was always the question. Every judge, every judicial decision, everything was about this question. But it turns out that when you answer one question, you have not answered any of the other ones. And a lot of people are going to suffer, and some people are going to die because of it. And to be told that, like, oh, now we're going to start caring about maternal mortality? Like, come on. Really? No.
So, Steve, you wanted to jump in?
Just really quickly, I think there are two other points to sort of piggyback on Jane's insights there. The first is, if we're going to talk about leaving things to the democratic process, let's talk about how undemocratic the process is, right? I live in Texas. Texas is, I think, fairly described as a 54-46 or 55-45 state in which Republicans have a supermajority in one chamber of the state legislature and almost a supermajority in the other, right? And we get performative, punitive policies shoved down our throats all the time because, thanks to gerrymandering, the election that matters is the primary, not the general, and so you get the extreme policies. So color me less optimistic that Texas is all of a sudden going to say, oh, now we're going to be conciliatory and moderate. But second, the whole idea of leaving things to the states kind of ignores the elephant in the room, probably because we've forgotten that they can do stuff, called the United States Congress. and the very real possibility that if Republicans control both chambers of Congress and the White House in 2025, we will see a push for a national ban on abortion. And it seems like that has to be part of the story as well. Oh, we're leaving things to the states until we have the power to actually take it away from the states.
Right. If you cannot tell Students for Life, like, great, we overturned this, and now we're going to work towards a 15-week ban. Like, no, that's not what's going to happen. And the return to federalism is not going to happen when you're telling people who voted on this issue, like, they want a 15-week ban, and they're going to fight for a 15-week ban, and they're going to fight for lower at the national level, even after saying it should be returned to the states this whole time.
And the other critical thing about what Jane said, and I think this is such an important sort of maybe segue to a broader topic, is the universe is different today than it was 2 days ago. And so when folks say, no, they'll never go after gay marriage, right? No, they'll never go after contraception. That was 2 days ago.
Right.
Right? And we already have the president of the Utah Senate saying, bring me a bill to ban gay marriage in Utah, right? We already have legislators in Mississippi and Idaho talking about banning contraceptives. So, I hope that calmer heads prevail. I hope those measures never make it out of those legislatures. I hope they're struck down by every court ever to touch them. But I don't know how we can look at what happened yesterday and the orchestrated, organized campaign that got us to yesterday and have any confidence that it's going to end there.
David, you have expressed confidence over the last 24 hours.
I think I might be a minority on this.
Yes,
panel.
yeah, you might.
I'm reading between the lines here.
I know, and you're.
Surprise.
No, and you've been very gracious letting everybody speak. But you have expressed a lot of confidence over the last 24 hours in your writing, and I think to a lesser extent in your tweeting. You've been very good about writing your opinions, which is nice. That this opinion is going to be confined just to abortion, and that we shouldn't be concerned about contraception and marriage equality and interracial marriage and all the things that are predicated on the notion of a constitutionally guaranteed right to privacy. Why are you so sanguine? I'm curious.
Because I know there are people in here who are immediately going to do what Twitter did to me all day yesterday. They say, you're an idiot and so naive. But I actually believe what Kavanaugh says. I believe when Alito specifically distinguishes those cases and says abortion is different, that he is setting his own precedent that is reaffirming these precedents. There's no indication that Roberts would sign on to this. So if I'm just doing the math in my head, you've got one who's clearly said, and by the way, what an unwise thing to do by Justice Thomas. I mean, just what
That's a sentence you could say so many times.
No, I have,
Like,
I have in many ways and in many times admired Justice Thomas, and that was very unwise. But let me say, I'm counting to a minimum of 6 that I don't think would touch these precedents. And so I am extremely skeptical that the Thomas dissent was anything that was a harbinger of things to come. And one other thing about this, and look, to say that I'm wrong, you just have to kind of believe, well, they're just lying. They're just lying. And
Can I
and
just,
look,
well, I mean,
I don't think they're lying. I don't think they're lying. I think
this
they're.
is not to. Kavanaugh did say that he considered Roe settled law, right? So I just want to ask the lawyers.
Yeah.
This. I mean,
So here's the thing about that.
Which is not. We do have a little bit of evidence. That,
Well, so here's the thing about that.
Yeah.
That's he was being technically correct and publicly misleading. That's what he was being. When you say something is settled law, when you're talking about a precedent, when you're talking about a precedent as settled law, you're just essentially saying it's precedent. It hasn't been overruled, right?
So how do we know he wasn't being technically correct but substantively misleading in
Because
his current opinion?
because his language was much clearer and very explicit in his opinion, and that's a court opinion, which is actual precedent, not a Senate hearing, which is not precedent at all. And one last thing. In defense of the pro-life movement, we have not focused exclusively on politics. We haven't. I have raised a ton of money for crisis pregnancy centers who are meeting people where they are in a time of crisis, loving them, caring for them. The abortion rate used to be double what it is now, double. And now it is less than half of what it was before, at the height of the abortion rate. It's less than it was when abortion was mainly illegal in the US in 1973 when Roe was decided. Many more women carry unplanned pregnancies to term than used to. That's the cultural work of the pro-life movement, and it doesn't make headlines because it doesn't win elections, but that has been happening.
But I want to jump in here because I think it's a really important point to make, which is that even if you provide, because I think that idea of like creating a culture in which abortion is unthinkable, that will never happen. You could have, in the world in which we have universal health care, in a world in which every single person is aware that if they carried a child to term, that they would have options available, people will still choose to have abortions. That will still happen.
In a world in which there are religions that believe that life begins at birth.
And especially because, again, if you are saying that, and I was doing some reading earlier where there's this idea, and because I keep going back to the idea of the punishments for abortion, because I think that that's incredibly important. And I think it's very notable that so many people from the anti-abortion movement have just basically said, well, we would punish the abortionist. You would go to clinics. You would go to, well, I feel as if that is operating in a world in which medication abortion is not increasing in popularity and increasingly available. Now, one, you have seen some states saying like, well, we would just curtail the mail that would make pills being sent in the mail illegal. And I'm like, good luck with that. That sounds complicated, and it gets involved in those interstate issues. But also when you are saying, again, if the person who is orchestrating the abortion is the woman having the abortion herself, then that punishment idea comes. And I want to raise another point very quickly, because I have a lot of thoughts. One thing, we keep talking about returning to the democratic process. And for one thing, when we are returning to the democratic process on a state-by-state basis because of federalism, we are not returning to the national opinion, we are returning to state-by-state opinions. And I think that dramatically changes the calculus for how we have to think about abortion and availability of abortion, or even what some people consider abortion to be. Because let's keep in mind that there are forms of birth control that several religions, including the one I was raised in, believe to be forms of abortion. I will also say that the idea, and I'm aware that this is, the Supreme Court and the role of the justice system is in general supposed to, in part, protect minority opinions. And it's complicated because sometimes you're in the majority and sometimes you're in the minority, and either way, it kind of sucks. But I will note here that on issues related to, say, interracial marriage, Loving versus Virginia, that's 1967. My parents got married in 1979. As an interracial couple, they're very happy, they're doing great, live in Ohio. The acceptance of interracial marriage hit 50% in 1993. My parents had been married for 14 years. Acceptance of same-sex marriage is now at an all-time high. Acceptance of same-sex marriage when Obergefell was passed was not there.
Right.
So often we are asking people, and we're asking the courts, and I understand that, like, yes, we would love to, in an ideal world, you would want people to come together in dialogue, to have, to make decisions together about what should be permissible and what should not be permissible. But if we waited until 1993 to make interracial marriage legal in a host of states that had bans, well, I would not be alive. And if we waited until same-sex marriage was acceptable to over 50% of the country, I would not be married. So, sorry.
This is very real.
I think that this is, I also think that occasionally it becomes a canard to immediately move on to issues of same-sex marriage or interracial marriage, and I think that sometimes people do that because they do not believe that they can get enough support just talking about the issue of abortion. I don't think that's true, and even if it were true, I do not care. Because I think that the issue of abortion itself is so critical to so many people, even people who would say that they would never have one themselves, even people who are against it for religious reasons. The ways in which abortion touches the lives of so many people who are here, so many people who are not, is the idea that we will just have a democratic debate at the state level about one of the most intimate concepts that a human can possibly endure, I don't know what will happen, and I don't think what will happen will be good. That is what I have to say.
Okay. Jane, I think the personal is political for you, and as it is for all of us, and I think that I'm deeply appreciative of how you framed it. I think it's also personal for David, and we shouldn't ignore that.
Yes.
That this is a deeply held conviction and belief, and I want to.
No one's happy.
I think no one's happy. No one's happy. I think that the practical, the takeaway, something that you were talking about, and let's get to that question, the question we talked about earlier. Let's say I want an abortion, and I live in a state where rape, incest, by the way, that's a new caveat that's been slathered on top of it, right? Okay, so, in all these states where you're not even in cases of rape and incest, can you get an abortion? I want to go to New York and I want to get an abortion. Who's on the hook? Legally, what does this look like? Can you answer that? And then also, to your point, at this point, I would love to maybe close on this idea that 60% of the country was in support of Roe. So the court just did overturn a law that was immensely popular. So this whole idea, the country was there. They were that far along, right? So I want to ask you about maybe the future of the court and our jurisprudence and the legitimacy of the court. That's where I want to end. But I also just want to know, what's prosecutable here?
So the short answer, we don't know. We don't know, and it's going to depend and vary dramatically by state, and all of this is going to get litigated. So you're going to have these states, to you all's points about maximalism and everything else that's going on. Texas is going to do a bounty hunter. Oklahoma's like, hold my beer. Missouri's like, we'll see you. We're going to do our own thing now, too. These laws are going to be wild. They're all going to be litigated. There is this effort to try to exert jurisdiction over women traveling across state lines. This was something that was in Justice Kavanaugh's concurrence to say, don't look at right to travel, nothing here. I think first justice who's ever even said that. We don't know. That means it's meaningless.
He waves his hands and says there's a right to travel.
But he felt strongly enough, knowing this was coming, to say that proactively, right? We know the landscape is.
So should we be reassured by that? Is that reassuring?
Oh, absolutely.
That he scribbled it, not to you?
Absolutely not. It's going to be litigated. The Department of Justice is the Attorney General said we are going to lean in on the right to travel 1,000% because everyone can see this wave coming. I think you're going to criminalize the current laws, these trigger laws. We haven't been clear about this. They criminalize the abortionist, the provider. We want to lock up doctors and nurses and social workers and people who are making these referrals, right? I think they're going to go after women who have abortions. They're going to try to criminalize out-of-state providers who are doing telemedicine for medication abortion, which is the vast majority of abortion. I think there's all these really complicated federal and state issues too. And so I think many of us are watching and waiting to see what the Biden administration does, all this interference. Does FDA approval of medication abortion trump some of these state laws? What can be salvaged here? And then how much is all going to run through the courts? And I think it's something that, Steve and I don't focus entirely on abortion. This is like one of the things we focus on. And this is just one part of a huge web in the ways that I think, health is increasingly being dictated by these court decisions. And I guess one more thing I want to say on contraceptives, because in this universe where abortion is going away, in many of these places, ideally you would ramp up on access to contraceptive, right? You would have a vending machine with Plan B everywhere you could put it if we really cared about this. And that is not what's going on. And there is already litigation below the Supreme Court that's bubbling up to undercut the Affordable Care Act's preventive services mandate, the Title X family planning program, Medicaid program. We are already dismantling, that's the point I want to make, access to contraceptives, especially for low-income women, in a way that's not going to fill this gap that we need. The preventive services mandate case is being brought by Jonathan Mitchell, who is the former Texas Solicitor General, who it was his brainchild to do the SB 8 bounty hunter abortion law in Texas. It is all connected, and I think we should be really, really concerned about it. And it's not over. They are going to go much, much further. Yeah, I had no good news for anyone today. Over to Steve.
Now, over to Steve. We are out of time. I want to make sure. Do we have time for Steve? Yes. Okay. Great.
I'll talk fast. I'm a New Yorker. To answer Katie's answer was so thorough. The direct answer to your question is, as of right now, you can travel out of state to get an abortion. Ask me again next week. And I do think it's worth pointing out the irony of Justice Kavanaugh breezily saying, don't worry, rich people, there's a right to travel, which is not anywhere in the Constitution, while concurring in an opinion, the whole central logical point of which is there's no right to abortion because it's not in the Constitution. There's a little bit of a tension there. the larger point, though, and this I think, I'm so mindful of what Jane said about not cutting the thread from the abortion piece of the story. This is such an important, it is really hard to think of a decision in our lifetimes from the Supreme Court that is going to have this kind of effect in every possible direction on people, on our politics, on how the court is perceived. And keep in mind, it was 24 hours after the New York Second Amendment case, about which I might have said the same thing until 10:10 yesterday morning.
Right.
So I think, folks have strong views about the Supreme Court. Those views tend to align increasingly, and to my mind, unfortunately, with their political preferences. The court has been heavily politicized before, but never quite this partisanized before. And I think the real problem, to me, as someone who studies the court and practices before the court, never successfully, is what happens when you have a Supreme Court where at least 5 of the justices seem to not care at all that there is a growing percentage of the country that thinks the court is illegitimate. Because if that majority cared, I think some of these decisions would come out at least a little, or at least there'd be a little more attempt to temper the opinion. One of the things that struck me the most about Justice Alito's majority opinion yesterday is how little it had changed from the draft we got on May 2nd that had been subject to such withering public scrutiny. Right? We're still talking about a domestic supply of infants. That is literally now in the pages of the US reports. Yep. And so it just seems to me that we need to think about, and the court needs to think about, how it's going to continue to persist. A court that has no ability to enforce its decisions by itself, if it's not going to at least try to appear, to mollify, to satisfy, to be part of a diverse, pluralistic society as opposed to just one side of an increasingly tribal debate.
I think we should end on that note.
Other than that, though.